The sack split when it hit the dirt grain rolling out like pale bones across the street, and the sound carried farther than any gunshot in a town that had learned to listen for trouble. And that was when Eli Mercer heard her whisper. Not loud enough for the men on the porches or the horse stamping behind him, but loud enough to tear through the years he'd spent teaching himself not to feel. Please, cover me. And he saw her on her knees in the dust, a young woman wrapped in a thin blanket that had slipped low, her shoulders raw with welts, her face marked by dried blood, and the kind of shame that never washed off. And for a moment, the street of Dry Creek went quiet, in a way that felt like the world holding its breath, the sun hanging low and cruel, lighting up the false fronts and hitching posts, the watching men, the rancher with the hammer in his fist who had been enjoying his power a little too much, and Eli's own hands, calloused and shaking, hanging useless at his sides as the past rose up like a bad ghost and reminded him of a promise he'd once broken. He had come into town for feed and salt, nothing more, a chore day, his mind on fences and weather and the long ride home. And now here he stood, a widower with a reputation for keeping his head down, staring at a girl who looked no older than 20, her hair dark and matted, her eyes wide and hollow, fixed not on the men who dragged her out but on him, as if something in his stance or his face had told her he was different, and that look undid him more than the hammer or the muttered laughter ever could. He told himself to turn away, told himself Dry Creek had its own rules and its own justice, told himself that stepping forward meant stepping back into a world he'd sworn off after burying his wife on a hill overlooking their ranch. But the whisper hung there, thin as a prayer, and the memory of Anna's voice when the fever took her rose up unbidden, asking him not to leave the room, asking him to stay, and his boots moved before his thoughts could catch them. The rancher with the hammer, Cal Haskett, squinted at him, sweat streaking down his bare arms, his smile crooked and mean, and asked if Eli had lost his way, and Eli felt the eyes of the town weigh him, felt the old fear and the older anger knot together in his gut, and he said nothing at first, because words felt too small, because the moment had gone beyond speech, and instead he shrugged out of his coat, the heavy canvas smelling of horse and smoke, and took another step closer, close enough to see the tremor in the girl's hands as she clutched the blanket, close enough to see the red dress lying in the dirt like a discarded life. He could hear his heart in his ears, could hear the wind rattling a loose sign, could hear the horse snort behind him as a rider shifted. And in that soundscape he remembered the last time he'd stood up to men like this, remembered how it ended, remembered the blood and the fire and the way justice never came clean. And he almost stopped, almost turned. But then she looked up at him again and whispered the words a second time. Please, cover me. And this time, there was something else in it. Not just shame, but a fragile hope that felt heavier than any sack of grain. Eli draped the coat around her shoulders, careful, as if she might break. And the contact sent a jolt through him, the simple act of decency feeling like rebellion. And Cal laughed and spat and told him he was making a mistake, told him the girl was a thief, a liar, a troublemaker who tried to run off with what wasn't hers. And Eli thought of all the things men called women when they wanted to excuse cruelty. Thought of the way the town had looked the other way when Anna got sick, and he didn't help, and he felt something settle in his chest, something solid and dangerous, and he said steady as he could, that whatever she'd done didn't give them the right to strip her dignity in the street. The word dignity tasted strange in his mouth, like a language he hadn't spoken in years, and it earned him a step forward from Cal, the hammer lifting slightly, and a murmur from the men lining the boardwalks. And Eli knew then there would be no easy end to this, that fate had turned its face toward him again, and it was not kind. He caught the girl's name from her lips when she breathed it into the space between them, Maeve, and he repeated it silently like a vow, feeling the weight of it settle alongside the weight of his coat on her shoulders. And when Cal swung the hammer into his palm and told him to mind his own business, Eli met his eyes and saw not strength but hunger, the kind that never filled. And he wondered how many times this town had fed it. He thought of his ranch, the long road home, the quiet evenings he'd built to keep the ghosts at bay. And he understood that by stepping forward, he'd already set fire to all of it, that there was no covering one person without exposing yourself. And as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the street as a rider dismounted and another hand drifted toward a gun, Eli felt the old fear give way to a colder resolve, because some whispers demanded an answer, and some moments decided a man whether he wanted them to or not. And when Cal raised the hammer higher and the town leaned in to see what would happen next, Eli tightened his grip on the coat around Maeve's shoulders and took one more step forward, not knowing if it would cost him his life, but knowing he could no longer step back. The hammer came down, not on flesh but on dust, as Eli moved faster than he thought possible, shoving Maeve behind him with one arm while the other caught Cal Haskett's wrist. The impact jarring bone and memory alike, and the street erupted into motion, boots scraping, a horse rearing, men shouting as if surprised by their own hunger for violence. And in that instant, Eli understood how close a town always lived to chaos, how thin the line was between order and the raw truth of who held power. Because when Cal yanked free and swung again, Eli felt the old reflex wake in his shoulders, the one he'd buried with his wife, and he stepped inside the arc of the blow, drove his forearm into Cal's chest, and heard the air rush out of him like a bellows collapsing, the hammer skidding away across the dirt to land beside the red dress, a symbol of how quickly cruelty lost its teeth when challenged. A gun cleared leather somewhere behind them, and Eli felt time stretch, each breath a measured thing, and he turned just enough to see Sheriff Rourke standing rigid near the saloon, his hand hovering, his eyes calculating the cost of action. And Eli met that gaze and held it, because some reckonings needed witnesses, and the sheriff's jaw tightened as he finally spoke Maeve's name aloud, asking what had been done to her, and the sound of it, spoken with authority, cracked something open in the cell. To retain his rap, Maeve's fingers dug into the canvas at Eli's back as she stood, trembling but upright now, her voice hoarse yet steady as she told him she'd been hired honest work, that Cal had cornered her, that the beating was punishment for refusing him. And with each word the town shifted, shame rolling through the onlookers like a late shadow, because truth had a way of naming everyone present. Cal tried to laugh it off, tried to bluster, but the sheriff took a step forward and the laughter died, and Eli felt the weight ease just a fraction, enough to breathe, enough to feel Maeve straighten beside him, the coat still around her shoulders like a promise kept. There was a moment when Eli thought the men might still turn, might still choose blood over consequence, but then the rider who dismounted earlier spoke up, a ranch hand from north of the creek, saying he'd seen Cal follow her, and another voice joined, and another, until the silence broke, in a way that felt final, and the sheriff ordered Cal's hands bound. And when Cal spat and swore and was dragged away, the town looked smaller somehow, as if a fever had broken. Eli's legs shook once the danger passed, and he leaned against a hitching post. The smell of sweat and dust thick in his nose, and Maeve touched his arm, a light, grateful touch that carried the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she still hoped for. And she asked where he was headed, and he said home, surprised to hear the word come out without pain. The sheriff approached then, softer now, and told Eli he'd done right, told Maeve she'd be safe tonight, and Eli nodded, knowing safety was never a thing you owned, only something you borrowed from courage. And as the crowd dispersed and the street returned to its uneasy normal, he bent to gather the spilled grain. Because some habits grounded a man, and because beginnings often look like cleaning up messes, he offered Maeve a ride out of town, not as a savior but as a neighbor, and she accepted with a tired smile. And the ride to the edge of Dry Creek felt longer than miles could explain. The land opening up, the sky turning copper, and Eli found himself speaking of Anna at last, of loss and the quiet that followed. And Maeve listened without pity, her eyes forward, understanding the shape of grief because it had shaped her too. At the fork where the road split, she asked if she could come with him for a while, work the ranch, learn the rhythms of a place that didn't ask more than honest labor. And Eli heard destiny again, not as thunder, but as a steady pull. And he said yes, because some futures arrived, not with certainty, but with the simple courage to say the word. They rode on as the first stars came out, 2 lives bruised but unbroken, carrying scars that would ache in the weather, yet teach them when to take shelter. and when the ranch lights finally glimmered in the distance. Eli felt the land accept them, the fences waiting, the work honest, the nights quiet enough for healing. And so if this story stirred something in you, if you felt the dust and the danger and the fragile mercy of one person stepping forward when it mattered, ride with us again by subscribing to Western Destiny Tales, because these roads are long, the choices heavy, and as long as such stories are told, destiny is never finished writing its next line.